Hi, I'm Nora Balint, and I'm here with Jimmy, and we're going to be talking about suicide today. Let me advance the slide so you can see the... Okay, I haven't done this yet. Help me. There we go. I'm Nora Balint. I'm a staff therapist here at the Refuge Center. I'm also the Zero Suicide Initiative Task Force leader at the Refuge Center, and I'm a community trainer for QPR, which is a suicide prevention protocol. Jimmy, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yes. I am Jimmy Boehm. I also work at the Refuge Center as a therapist and the accessibility coordinator.
During this presentation, we're going to be talking about suicide. We're going to be talking about the warning signs and the risk factors for suicidal crisis. And we're going to also be sharing a very personal story of a suicide attempt. So I want to invite everyone here in the room today to be very aware of your own needs and your own reactions to that. Discussions like this can be very hard and heavy and even triggering sometimes. So please honor your own needs. And if you need to step out for a few minutes, we want you to honor that and respect that, and we fully support that. If you need a little bit of extra support, we also have several of our therapists and several of our colleagues from Mental Health America here who would be happy to step out with you for a few minutes if that's something you need. So for any of those therapists in the room who would be willing to step out if someone needed that, can you please just raise your hands so people can kind of see who you are? We have a few of them in the back, a few by the doors. So if you see any of these hands and you need a little bit of help, please feel free to ask for that or take a moment. If you need to step up and go to the restroom or take a phone call, please do that as well. And for everyone else who want to invite you, not to assume why someone might be stepping out of the room. But we are going to be talking about risks and warning signs. Once I figure out how to advance my slides. There we go. All right, so for the first thing I want to go over is, what is a mental health crisis? A mental health crisis is any situation in which a person's behavior puts them at risk for harming themselves or someone else, or prevents them from being able to care for themselves or function effectively in community. A mental health crisis is often accompanied by feelings of overwhelming emotional pain, frustration, hopelessness, loneliness, powerlessness, worthlessness, shame, guilt, rage, and/or self-hatred. A mental health crisis may or may not also be involved in a suicidal crisis, meaning that someone might be in a mental health crisis without having suicidal ideation, or they may. You can have both. So what are some of the warning signs of a mental health or a suicidal crisis? Someone might be giving away personal possessions. They may be talking as if they're saying goodbye. They may be taking steps to tie up loose ends, creating a will. They may be stockpiling pills or obtaining a weapon. There may be dramatic changes in their personality, their mood, their normal behaviors. There may be increased drug use or alcohol use. They may show withdrawal from friends, family, their normal activities. They may have failed romantic relationships. There may be a history of suicide attempts or other self-harm. There may be a sense of hopelessness or helplessness. In fact, I always say that I feel like hopelessness is one of the biggest warning signs that a suicidal crisis might be building, and certainly a mental health crisis. I did it. So this slide that we're looking at right now talks about a suicidal crisis episode. Just like there are many warning signs, there are also many risk factors for a suicidal crisis. This slide shows a list of risk factors on the right. A recent loss or a perception of loss. And by that, I mean that if a person perceives that they've had a loss, they have had a loss, regardless of the way that it might appear to someone else. If someone perceives that they've lost something, then they have. Isolation, lack of support, trauma, a family history of mental health issues, especially depression, previous suicide attempts, cultural and religious beliefs, feelings of hopelessness, although like I said before, that's a warning sign rather than a risk factor, a family history of child maltreatment, a history of substance abuse, access to firearms. So that's on the right side of this slide. On the left side of this slide, we have a graph. It kind of looks like a mountain. As you look at the risk factors, I want you to be aware some of these might be risk factors that have been present someone's whole life. As you can see, like a family history of mental health issues, that's something you would be born into. Your whole family already has that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to enter a mental health crisis yourself, but it's a risk factor. Others on this risk factor list might be acute events. So the graph that we show on the left, it kind of looks like a mountain. There's a flat section on the left, a period of stability, where a person may already have a number of these risk factors, maybe just one or two, maybe a whole litany of them, but they're stable, and that person may be stable for many years, and they're not in crisis. But at some point in their story, something happens, a situational trigger of some point. It could be that one or more of these risk factors gets worse. It could be that they have a new event, a new loss, or a new trauma that they experience. But something happens that begins a crisis period. And so on this graph, you can see that a hazard is encountered, and then the crisis starts to build up towards this peak. The crisis might build over the course of months or days. And then in the middle of this chart, we have this peak, this crisis peak. There's a sliver of time, and you can see across the bottom I have times laid out. It could be a matter of years for the stability, a matter of maybe days or months for the crisis building. But that crisis peak can be just a matter of hours or even minutes. And in those minutes, in that hour, that's when the risk for suicide is the greatest, is the highest. If a person gets through this peak, then the graph shows a period where the crisis is diminishing, again, over maybe days or months or sometimes even years, where that person may return to a period of stability. We're going to hear Jimmy's story today. We can talk about statistics. Actually, please go back to that for just a moment. We can talk about the statistics and the typical warning signs and risk factors, but it's also really important to remember that these stories are also so personal and so nuanced. It's important to remember the person in the story and to recognize their story might not follow exactly what we learn in a training or what we read about in our learnings. So I want you to keep this image in mind as we hear Jimmy's story. What are the warning signs you do hear? What are the warning signs you don't hear? What are the risk factors? How might some of them have been there but not visible for others to see? And where did it turn from stable but at risk to a crisis beginning and a crisis peak? Jimmy, will you share your story with us?
Yes, I'd be glad to, and thank you, Nora, for doing a great job of introducing that and explaining it. It's very complicated, many pieces, kind of like a snowflake. Not everyone's different and unique in its own way. And so here's the Cliff Notes version, but a lot to it. So I was born in Germany. I was an Army brat and grew up in Germany, moved to Tennessee when I was about 8 years old, and graduated there in West Tennessee. And then from that time, I was a happy kid, pretty resilient. I was the person that people would usually go to talk to and to talk about problems and so forth. And so from an early age, by 20, I had my own business, I had married, and I was doing quite well financially, and had the goals of starting a family and building my business and so forth. So everything looked like things were going well. It wasn't until about 2006 where things started to turn with issues within my marriage. My wife left, and so separation began, which was a very difficult time for me because I was hoping that we would be able to work through things. And that was probably one of the hardest things I learned, was that you can't make someone do anything they don't want to do. So needless to say, was informed that my wife wanted a divorce. And so that was a hard hit. And so here's someone who would always be here to support people and to talk to people and encourage them. And now I found myself in depression. I found myself beginning to isolate, not answering the door when people would check on me. And so looking back now, I knew I was sad, I was down, depressed, and who else would not feel that way if they're going through a tough time? But it got bad, and it just kept on feeling like it just kept getting worse and worse, to a point where it's just like, what's the point? Never had the thought of hurting myself or causing harm to myself, but it was just that feeling that something bad's gonna happen, and I don't know. It just feels like every day I'm not gonna be able to get out of this, that things are not gonna get better, which is what hopelessness is. And so this kind of continued on, and through my depression, I also, about 2009, being in a deep divorce, which ended up actually lasting 6 years. So, divorce is hard, so imagine a 6-year divorce. In 2009, I did have another relationship with someone, and we thought we were having a child. And so I was very excited about that. I was going to be a dad. Come to find out, it wasn't my child, and the mother had told me that it was mine. And so that was another hit that hurt me really, really hard. So there was another piece. So during that time with this depression, I didn't know anything about counseling. I didn't know anything about hotlines or anything like that. Continued to isolate myself, and then began self-medicating. So the few people I would hang out with, they'd say, hey, we're going to take you out for a good time. Get your mind off of this. And, so we'd go out, dance, party, drink. So I began self-coping and self-medicating with drinking, which led then to drugs. And as the divorce got worse, and just this feeling of that things aren't going to get any better, the divorce got to the point to where it felt that it was all about material goods and money. And so I'm like, if it's all about money, I don't care. So I began quit paying bills. And so I remember literally grabbing a handful of bills, walking into my office, and just throwing them in on the floor and shutting the door. Continued to self-medicate, right? Like I said, taking drugs. I just wanted to numb myself. I was trying to find a way to keep myself from hurting. And so that was going on. And then living in my house was very difficult, because those were those memories where I was supposed to have a family and raise kids and so forth. And so I couldn't live at home. Well, I had heard about a family that was being not evacuated, but they were being kicked out of their apartment. They had 3 little ones. And so I said, well, I have a house. I'll move all my stuff out. You can stay there temporarily, a couple weeks till you find yourself another place. I was just trying to help someone. Made the huge mistake of not having a contract signed or anything in writing. So this family moved in, and then I could not get them out. And then they destroyed this beautiful house that I worked so hard to take care of and to build and create. And so I was dealing with that. And so by January 2010, January 23rd, it was just a hard day that whole month just felt like a fog. I felt like a zombie, like I was just going through the motions. If you think about that time, the economy had really slowed down quite a bit. My business was in the automotive restyling business, and so the automotive industry was pretty much at a standstill. And so that day, my few jobs that I had lined up didn't work out. And so that was challenging. I had enough money to put gas in my car for the day, or my Suburban, which that was a horrible vehicle for gas. Yeah. But so I was like, am I gonna have enough just to get back to my friend's house who I was staying with? Had to deal with those people in my house, destroying the house, and how am I gonna get them out of there, and what that's gonna look like. Got a call from the ex-wife to be, and those calls always felt like someone ripping the rug from underneath me. And so all that was happening at once, and I just remember that day, I was like a zombie. Well, late evening, I was getting ready to head back to my friend's house, and came across a roadblock, just a random roadblock, and the officer asked for my driver's license, and he said, "Did you notice that he looked mad at me already, so I was like, oh gosh. So, but he said, your headlight is out, and I'm like, no, I didn't know that. I literally had just worked on those, so don't let me work on your headlights, which I wouldn't do that now anyways. But, so I said, well, actually, I've misplaced my driver's license because I just moved out of my house. I put everything in storage, and when I did that, I've misplaced it. I haven't been able to find it, but I do have my handgun permit, which has that same information, but it's not a license, it's a handgun permit. So he said, well, that's not gonna work, but go ahead and give it to me. So he took it, went back to his vehicle, and then he came back a few minutes later, and I could see the expression of his face. I'm like, oh no, what now? And he says, did you know your license is suspended? I said, no. Why is my license suspended? He said, well, you have an unpaid speeding ticket in Nashville from a year ago. And I was like, I remember paying that ticket. I did, but I'm like, oh my gosh. He said, well, you've got a headlight out. Your license is suspended. I need you to pull over and get out of the vehicle. And as he was saying that, I noticed on my side mirrors and my rear view mirror that there were 4 other officers starting to kind of walk around my Suburban with their hands on their side. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because I'm like, if I get out of this vehicle, who knows what's gonna happen. I've never been in trouble before, but like everything just hit me at once. I panicked. And I took off. So I hit the pedal to the metal, and then engaged in about a 7 to 9 mile police chase. Got off on a side road, pulled up behind a little community center, and my vehicle got stuck a little bit on an embankment because it had been raining. The police surrounded the backside of the vehicle. They got out, they drew their guns, and they told me to get out of the vehicle. And I just remember me just putting my hands up and saying, please, just leave me alone. Please just leave me alone. And so, they continued to yell at me and move closer. So I put my vehicle in full-wheel drive to try to see if I could get up the embankment. And at that point, the officers began to shoot. They shot out my rear tires, but also shot out my side windows, my rear windows. There were bullets that were within inches of hitting me that went through my passenger side, so I'm glad there wasn't anyone with me. They would have been hit. So again, I panicked. It could have been an opportunity for de-escalation, but I panicked. So I was able to get free in about 1/8 of a mile. I jumped out of my vehicle, grabbed my gun, and ran into this field. Found a tree line with this one tree kind of sticking out. And again, this is January. It's now getting dark and it's getting cold. And I remember laying on my stomach, kind of shivering. My glasses fell off, so couldn't see very well, kind of blurry. But I'm like, I guess this is it. This is that bad thing that I didn't know what was going to happen. Like, how am I going to get out of this now? I hear the sirens, and I hear more police sirens come up. Then I started hearing dogs behind me barking. I'm like, oh, great, now they got the canine unit coming after me. Then I hear a helicopter up ahead. And so I'm like, cool. And it just sounded like those noises were getting closer and closer. I could see lights. And I'm like, I guess this is it. And so I grabbed my gun. It was a .45 caliber, and I pointed it at my forehead on my right side here. And I pulled the trigger. Well, the gun jammed. It did not fire. And so I was like, what? And I said, I paid way too much for this gun, but it was an expensive gun. But anyway, so I unchambered the gun, and when I tried to unchamber it, it discharged. And when it discharged, then I was afraid that, oh no, now they think I'm shooting at them, and now they're really gonna be mad at me. And so out of panic, I rechambered the gun, pointed it quickly, again in the same area, and then pulled the trigger, and I shot myself in the head. I think that was the shot that saved my life, because I think if that initial shot would have been successful, I would not be here right now. But out of panic and fear and quickness, it changed the trajectory of the bullet. So the police, they found me, and I was still awake. I actually got up and was waving my hands. I couldn't speak because my jaw had been shattered. The whole right side of my face was shattered. I could not see, but officers came. I begged them to finish me off. They wouldn't do it. So I was airlifted in a helicopter to the Med in Memphis, and I woke up 3 days later. And so a lot of the stuff that I'm telling you now, I did not remember till days after I woke up. Some of this months until after I woke up. But I woke up 3 days later in the hospital. I couldn't see. My arms and legs were restrained because they were in fear that if I woke and panicked, that I'd reach and pull things. I had a breathing tube down my throat, so I couldn't speak. So I couldn't see, I couldn't speak, I couldn't move. I didn't know what happened. They said I had a 20% chance or 25% chance of survival, but I did not know what was going on. But then at that point, I heard a voice, and I guess my father saw me kind of waking up, and I heard his voice, and I knew someone was there. And I remember making this little hand gesture with the movement I could do, and my dad brought a pen and paper, and I wrote down, and he still has this today, but I wrote down, where am I, what happened? And so it was then where I had to kind of start to things come together as to what happened, like what happened and what am I gonna do? Now I still have all these things I'm dealing with, depression and a divorce, but now I'm blind. How do I be blind? Does that mean I'm in a nursing home the rest of my life? Then it was, oh gosh, what legal trouble am I in now, right? So all those things were kind of hitting me at once. And so that was really, really hard. That was probably the hardest moment of my life, is when I could not communicate in any way, and just realize like all these troubles and issues and problems were still there, and now how am I going to get through it, and what is that going to look like? But it was after about 3 or 4 days of and 2 other surgeries that I remember waking up, my dad coming in, I hear his voice, and I told my dad, I said, Dad, I realize I have 2 options in life. And he was like, well, what's that? I said, I can either be a bump on a log and have people take care of me the rest of my life. I said, or I can face this head on and figure out what I need to do to be independent. So I told my dad, I said, can you hand me the phone? So he handed me the phone, and I called my sister. It took it the second time to do it because, dialing without seeing is a little challenging. Can do it now. But I called my sister, and I said, can you Google the Braille alphabet? Because I guess I'm going to have to learn this, so I might as well do it now while I'm in the hospital. And so I left the hospital 2 weeks later learning the Braille alphabet through the letter P. And so, so that was just the beginning of this story, because not only did I have to deal still with the depression and the mental health, and learn about what that was and how that was a very important part of my life, but also still had to deal with the legal ramifications. How can a blind person be in prison, in jail? What's that going to look like? Will I ever be able to be independent again? And then the divorce. So I had to deal with all of those things. So it was hard and quite a journey. But what I have found is that I'm here, and it's a hard story to tell, but I'm able to tell it, and that's why I'm here today. I have that purpose that if I can help one person and save one life, then that fulfills the reason why I'm still here.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. And before we even go any further, I know that's a hard story to tell, and we appreciate it. And I just want to tell you personally, I am so glad that you are here and that you did make it through. So I want to revisit the slides that we talked about previously. So if you could advance to the next one. Oh, yeah. So we've pulled back up the slide about a mental health crisis. Studies show that most, but definitely not all, people communicate their intent to attempt suicide in the week leading up to it. But in your case, you did not, partially because there was no intent. There was no intent to harm yourself until the moment that it actually happened. But there was a chain of events that led up to it, and there were some warning signs that you were in a mental health crisis. So I've pulled up this slide again, the same one we had before, but I've highlighted some of the ones that I heard in your story. Giving away personal possessions, dramatic changes in your personality, mood, or behavior, increased drug and alcohol use, withdrawal from friends, family, and normal activities, failed romantic relationship, and that sense of hopelessness or helplessness. Was there any more that you wanted to say about any of those, or?
Again, like you said, there are no two situations that look the same. You may see all of these, you may see some of these. Not everyone's going to have a plan, right?
Yeah.
It just could be just something that just pushes them over the cliff, and it just happens. But these are definitely things that are important to look at and take note of and not ignore.
Yeah. And then our next slide, I've brought back that same slide about the suicidal crisis episode. And Jimmy, this time, I've got this same slide showing with that image of the suicidal crisis and the suicidal peak. Up the left-hand side of that slope, where the crisis is building, I've listed a lot of the events or situations that I heard in your story that contributed for you to that building crisis. And you'll notice down across the bottom, the trajectory is a little different because each story is a little different. So the period of stability lasted for years. And then the risk was increasing also for years because you were saying your divorce lasted so many years, just kind of going through that whole process. And then the crisis over the couple of months before that peak was building. So up the left-hand side of this image, we have the building up to that peak moment. And on the right, where we have the risk factors, I've highlighted some of the ones that I heard in your story. And for those of you looking at this slide, I've put a little arrow beside the three that Jimmy, I heard you say were there in your story that very day of the traumatic incident. So the ones that I have an arrow by, the recent loss, so you mentioned the jobs that you had lost earlier that day, that feeling of numbness from that, the trauma of the incident with the police, access to firearms that day. But I also have highlighted you had other losses that had accumulated here: isolation, lack of support, that feeling of hopelessness, history of substance abuse. Was there anything more you wanted to say about those here at this point?
I think one of the things you mentioned earlier, giving away of belongings, that was something I forgot to mention in my story, was that with the depression and again, no plan, but just, just survival mode
Yeah.
was, with the economy and not working much and isolating. I would, I sold my $3,000 TV for $100 just so I could get some gas and buy some food or get some drugs. I was doing that just to survive and get by. I was in survival mode.
Yeah, yeah. And then in the next slide, we're going to focus on the other side of that arc. So in this slide, it's the same peak, but we're focusing on the right-hand side where the crisis diminishes. So this slide shows that even after the suicidal crisis is over, and you mentioned this in your story, the crisis is diminishing, but the factors that led up to it, a lot of them were still there for you. So the anxiety and depression remained. There are now new losses to deal with, the blindness, a possible loss of independence, a long list of legal ramifications, no insurance, financial limitations, so still a lot going on. But then there were also elements that helped you begin to see hope in your situation and factors that helped the crisis diminish. There was family support, and you mentioned your dad's voice being supportive there for you and making you feel like somebody had shown up for you. I noticed that it was at this time, when we talked about your story a few days ago, that we were talking through this, and you were saying that it was at this moment also that it became clear that the divorce was final. And so I was just wondering if that offered some resolution, though not pleasant, not what you wanted. I'm wondering if that resolution to that issue that had been going on for so long also played a role in kind of being on the other side of that peak.
Yes, definitely. When I woke up not long after I had awakened, my ex-wife actually was there, which then was like, maybe she cares. But what I found out was that the hospital staff had asked her to find out medical history on me, and she said, "I'm not helping you. What good is he to me anymore?" And so to find out that she said that, and then was actually seeking legal advice because she didn't want to be responsible for any medical bills, was the thing that where it just kind of nail in the coffin. It's like, this is definitely, this is it. There is no hope in this relationship, which then helped me to really start to focus on my own self and getting myself better.
Yeah, and you mentioned that at that point you saw you had two options. Tell us a little bit more about those two options that you saw.
Yeah, I mean, and I literally said those words: either be a bump on the log, or figure out how to face this head on. I didn't know what face head on meant. I didn't know what that would look like, but I was always a person that was independent, person that I thought was strong and resilient, and I was literally at rock bottom. And so, but I knew I was going to need help, and I knew I was going to need supports to be able to do that. So some of the things that you mentioned, like my family, I could not have done it without my family. Could not have done it without my faith. Could not have done it without meeting other people who had experienced what I did through my intensive group therapy and intensive outpatient, to meet other people that were in very difficult situations. But then also finding out how they found hope in my own story also helped me to grow as well.
Down the right-hand side of this slope, I listed a few of the things that you told me about that you started to do to start kind of taking control of your own story at this point. And I noticed that of those two options that you saw, neither of them included suicide at this point. So once you were through that peak, the options ahead of you and the struggles and the choices, which were so many and so overwhelming before, had now been simplified. I've got this choice or that one, and that neither of them involved suicide as one of your choices. And so you saw some hope there and began to take control over your story. So learned Braille, you got mobility training, learned jiu-jitsu, connected to other supportive people, and got mental health help as well. And then, can you tell us a little bit more about how people can help? So what might have been helpful to you, both as the crisis was building and also in that crisis peak during that interaction with the police?
Yeah, so, as was mentioned earlier, looking back now, hindsight's 2020, but there could have been opportunities where that evening where things could have been de-escalated, right? But it's hard, and I just think very highly of our first responders and officers that do a really, really hard job. So that's just a hard thing to work through and know what to do in that situation. Again, so family supports, just being there. Don't give up on that person. If they don't answer the door the first time, doesn't mean you can't come back and try again, right? I just think so much of that story earlier of the officer that saw someone on the rail and he turned around. He was intentional, right? And he showed a personal interest in that person, which that person probably felt very hopeless and helpless, that no one cared and that they were all alone, and here comes this stranger coming, right? I think another thing too is be careful not to judge. And I was one of those people. Like, how could someone try to take their life? How selfish are they to do those things? Well, you know what? We're thinking in a clear mind when we think those things or say those things. But those people that are at rock bottom, they can't think that way. They're not able to think clearly. So trying to understand that they may not be able to see that there's hope and help, but we can try to offer that to them. And also just knowing what those resources that are out there, what are those hotlines that I can share? What are those resources, things that I can say to a person? And again, just showing a personal interest can make a huge difference and save a life.
One of the things that, as people consider reaching out for help, the myth is that if I tell someone that I am thinking of suicide, they will send me to the hospital. But the truth is there are models of suicide care, and sometimes the hospital is where someone needs in order to be safe. But there are strength-based options for suicide care that do not involve hospitalization now. And they involve showing empathy, compassion, identifying and accessing resources, just like you said, learning and practicing healthy coping skills, stabilization, collaborative safety planning, offering hope and providing people a sense of agency and control and helping them see the hope through the fog that has been clouding their vision for so long and still continues to do so, offering that collaborative support.
And these things that you mentioned, this isn't done over a period of days or weeks. This is a long process, right? And an ongoing process.
Yeah.
And for me, even my story, I still have good days and bad days. But these tools that I've learned, these skills and supports that I've gained, I have that now to fall back on, which I didn't before.
And we have some resources. We're going to flash a QR code as we leave this stage. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. We've compiled a list. We had such a limited time, but there's so many resources we wanted to share that you can scan that here. And if you want to receive a digital copy, and then you should be able to sign up outside for a list of those that we can send by email. Thank you so much.